Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the History Speaks reading series of the Arab role in Africa. Today, we're going to be taking a look at Chapter 4, Al-Azhar University and Arab Nationalism. Islam undoubtedly helps the cause of Arab nationalism in Africa. Many Arab nationalists regard Islam, as well as the radio, the press, and Pan-African organizations, as a weapon in their fight. For them, Islam is a tool to be used when the historical context demands it, and discarded when no longer of use. President Gamal Abdel Nasser is far from being the Muslim fanatic that some of his opponents pretend. Indeed, while using religion whenever possible, he has shown himself to be unequivocally hostile to pan-Islamism as preached by its spokesmen in Amman, Karachi, and Tehran. The whole concept of an Islamic federation in Africa and Asia, in fact, runs directly counter to the objectives of Arab nationalism. The Cairo government, therefore, refuses to listen to any talk of a pan-Islamic grouping. President Nasser categorically stated at Karachi in 1960, "Our country does not favor the creation of an Islamic federation." Agnostic or not, however, the Egyptian president has realized the political importance of Islam in the Arab world and in Africa. For no one who has lived in Africa can fail to be aware of the power exercised by Islam in many parts of the continent. Who can forget how the marabouts take young boys from their mothers at an early age, enroll, indoctrinate, and temper them? Who can overlook the immense prestige of the Hajj, the man who has made the pilgrimage to Mecca? How the returned pilgrim is welcomed with a special veneration, how thousands come simply to touch the robes of one sanctified by such a journey. Yet for many Muslims, while Mecca is the holy land of Islam, Cairo is the center of cultural diffusion. The prestige of Al-Azhar University is immense. As far back as the 15th century, students came from the ends of Africa to study the Quran and the Prophet's teachings there. And Arab nationalism has not been slow to use so valuable a source of influence, of which a northern Nigerian pilgrim said, "Nigerian Muslims regard Al-Azhar as the center and leadership of the Muslim world." The Egyptian Africanists always emphasized that in the 15th and 16th centuries, young West Africans came to Cairo to study Islam, braving the most arduous and dangerous journeys in order to do so. It was Al-Azhar alone, according to Nahdatu Ifriqiya, that enabled the Arab tide in Africa to survive the Middle Ages. This tide not only continues today, it is gathering force, working through the hundreds of young Africans who come to study at what the Egyptians proudly call the fountainhead of Islamic culture in Africa. Al-Azhar and the Azaris have always been notorious for their docility before the temporal power. In this they are not unique. Other instances can be found in Muslim Africa. President Bourguiba of Tunisia, for example, is far from being a strict or traditionalist Muslim. He has prohibited polygamy and decreed that the Ramadan fast should be optional. Yet the Tunisian ulema have often shown their readiness to extend their spiritual authority to such measures. In the same way, Egypt's religious dignitaries have lent their support, or at least their acquiescence, to the actions of their government. In February 1955, the rector of Al-Azhar, Abdelrahman Taj, protested against the blasphemous use by Tehran radio of a translation of the Quran. He emphasized the orthodox view that the ideas of the Quran and the divine meaning cannot be expressed in any other terms than those chosen by God himself. Later, the Egyptian government decided that the Quran should be translated into all living languages, and the rector of Al-Azhar remained silent. In April 1956, the ulema of Al-Azhar, in an official judgment, declared that the Sharia, Muslim law, forbids women to exercise legislative functions. 17 months later, 2 women were elected to the Egyptian parliament. There were no demonstrations at Al-Azhar. Again, the rector of Al-Azhar declared that the university would not consider modernizing its teaching by the introduction of lay subjects and faculties such as medicine and science. He even went so far as to add, "It would be a crime that I could never permit at any price." 2 years later, the crime was committed. The Egyptian National Assembly passed a law which effectively created the faculties in question. Worse still, the law decreed that lectures should not be in Arabic alone, but in French and English as well. And worst of all, the law obliged Al-Azhar to cease restricting its theological teaching to the orthodox Sunni doctrines, as had been the practice since the university's foundation 1,000 years before, but to include courses which reflected the other three schools of Islamic doctrine widespread in Africa and Asia. The university was also reformed by the appointment of a majority of lay professors as heads of faculty. In fact, of course, it is inconceivable that Al-Azhar could ever be independent of the Egyptian state, which financially maintains it. Al-Azhar, for the year 1961 to 1962, was allocated 3,069,000 Egyptian pounds, over 3 million pounds sterling, an enormous sum for Egypt. It is therefore not surprising that Al-Azhar, the bulwark of Islamic orthodoxy, whose prestige abroad is so great, should work as an instrument of the temporal authorities in Egypt, whether they be Farouk's or Nasser's. It may be recalled that in Farouk's reign, the ulema, purely to please the king, published an official statement which declared him to be descended from the Prophet, though it was widely known that the royal family was not even Arab in origin. Whether traditional or modernized, however, Al-Azhar's influence could not be neglected by Arab nationalists. In this field, one of the recent initiatives of the Egyptian government was the creation, in March 1960, of a liaison bureau of Islamic peoples to study the problems of Muslim society. The bureau was especially charged with the task of reinforcing the fraternal bonds between the Muslim peoples and the Guidance Center of Cairo by creating Islamic centers in every Muslim country and encouraging each country to establish a Cairo office. The head of the bureau declared, "We must organize resistance to imperialist aggression against Islam." A congress of some 200 liaison officers from African and Asian Muslim countries was held during 1960 in Cairo. Addressing hundreds of pilgrims on their return from Mecca, the Egyptian Minister of Religious Affairs, Abdallah Tuima, declared, "I believe that Islam has once again a part to play in the struggle for world freedom. The masses of African pilgrims who come to visit the holy places are the forerunners of our victory. Our path is mapped out. We must send them the Quran and explain it to them. Forward in the struggle for Islam." In June 1960, the same official was quoted as reporting to another commission of ulema on the Egyptian leadership of the Islamic movement and the way the Muslim peoples are looking to Cairo for leadership. In the same month, 35 heads of various pilgrim contingents from Africa and Asia met in Cairo to proclaim their complete adherence to the policy of the UAR, which strengthens the united will of the Muslim peoples. It is understandable that, under these circumstances, Al-Azhar, encouraged by the Egyptian government, should have become strongly Africanist during the last few years. One has only to glance at the contents of Al-Azhar Review, a heavy periodical of 160 pages, for December 1960. Of 4 articles on specific areas, there are 2 on Africa, one on Al-Azhar's place in Africa and the other on Islam in East Africa. Al-Azhar's interest in Africa is profitably repaid. With millions of animists, Africa is the only continent where fruitful missionary work is possible, while local custom tends to favor Islam rather than Christianity. The missionary effort of Al-Azhar in Africa has recently received considerable help from the Egyptian state, which in 1958 began to provide it with a large annual grant, and the Training and Orientation Institute of the Missionary Section has started laying particular emphasis on the teaching of French and English. Since February 1960, the Ministry of Religious Affairs has been working on an ambitious scheme to create a corps of Muslim missionaries specially trained for work in countries with only a small Muslim majority. And in April 1961, the rector of Al-Azhar promised the leader of the Kenya Muslim Association that specially trained Azhari missionaries with a knowledge of English and Swahili would soon be sent to Kenya. At first, Al-Azhar claimed that it was not trying to prejudice the position of Christianity in Africa, and Sheikh Mohammed al-Bahi, Inspector of Missions, emphatically stated, "We do not wish to Islamize Christians." But competition has proved unavoidable, especially as the two religions reflect such different characters. For, despite the effort to Africanize themselves, the Christian churches in African eyes often remain institutions established and run by whites. And while in general the churches support Africa's progress towards independence, on specific issues they have often adopted positions that appear anti-black. The Vatican's Osservatore Romano wrote in June 1960, The masses in some parts of Africa have not yet reached an adequate level of education for independence. Naturally, this statement was given widespread publicity in the Arab press. Statements and articles show that Cairo's Arab nationalists are determined to conduct the struggle by every means at their disposal. In January 1961, the rector of Al-Azhar said, "The call of Al-Azhar cannot be limited by any frontiers. The Azhari missions will spread across the world to show people the true face of Islam and defend it against the attacks of its enemies." What is the role of Al-Azhar in the face of the missionary waves that imperialism is sending into Africa? Well, Al-Azhar will counter this attack by sending her own missions to every African country. You may be sure that since those other missions are the creation of imperialism, they will in time disappear without trace. 5 days later, the Egyptian Minister for Muslim Affairs joined in the chorus with a declaration that Islam in Africa is facing cultural aggression no less deadly than imperialism's armed attacks. And in commentating on events in the Congo, the Egyptian papers went even further, stating that the Christian missions, which had come to Africa ostensibly to bring modern civilization with their faith, had instead paved the way for colonialism, a colonialism which brought nothing but took everything. One paper approvingly quoted the maxim, "When colonialism came to Africa, it had the Gospels and the Africans had the land. Now the Africans have the Gospels, but the colonialists have their land." In the general framework of the struggle against white colonialism, and by extension the Christian Church, Egyptian publications remind the Africans that the papacy once approved the slave trade, under the pretext of saving the souls of the slaves through baptism, and that the only condition the hierarchy had laid down was that a priest should sail on every slaver. Egypt also supports other Muslim countries in their struggle against Christian missions. In the southern Sudan, the struggle between Islam and Christianity has reached a state very near crisis. The Catholic news agency, Fides, has stated that the Sudanese government's policy is to stifle the church in the south, and has reproached the Arabic press in general for showing a marked hostility to the missions. The Egyptian papers, on the other hand, have carried enthusiastic reports on Sudan's fight to safeguard Islam. One of these reports began by claiming that ever since the advent of colonialism, the Southerners had been denied sufficient opportunity to emerge from pagan ignorance and choose their own religion. Quote, "This was a deliberate attempt by the British to divide the South from northern Sudan, and they victimized those Southerners who embraced Islam and had any contact with the Muslims. The majority of the tribal chiefs in the South were not only denied contact with the Muslims, but incited to oppress them. When the colonialists were expelled, it was inevitable that a struggle should begin to Arabize the education system and to spread Islamic culture. This has been done without attacking other faiths, but simply by giving equal opportunities to all impartially." The report concluded by quoting the Sudanese Minister of Religious Affairs as saying that the government in no way supports one faith against another. Rather, it pretended our aim is to help those who were oppressed in the past and never had the right to the religion of their choice. Al-Azhar had not only been modernized, it has become modernist. Some 10 years ago, the Islamic University was still at the stage of the sheikh, seated on a carpet, surrounded by students of all colors, to whom he explained the full significance or correct pronunciation of some Quranic text. In one leap, Al-Azhar has attempted to progress from the carpet to the space age. At the end of 1958, an official from Al-Azhar declared, "We want to have our own radio station, whose role would be in no way inferior to that of the Voice of the Arabs." It must here be recalled that Glub Pasha once described the Voice of the Arabs as the, quote, "most powerful political weapon in the Arab world." And so there was created a new broadcasting service called the Voice of Islam, which has been broadcasting cultural programs to different countries in their own languages. It is interesting to note that the Second Pan-African Lutheran Conference in September 1960 decided to establish a powerful new radio station near Addis Ababa in Ethiopia and to call it the Voice of the Gospel. Islamic influence shows itself in other ways. In the Somali Republic, for example, the UAR embassy asked for extra credits to finance the publication and distribution of a magazine called Al-Azhar's Mission, and in June 1961, an agreement was signed between the Somali government and Al-Azhar on the opening of a religious college at Mogadishu, affiliated to the Islamic University in Cairo. Another religious college had been opened a year earlier in northern Somalia. It is significant that the student body at Al-Azhar represents an ever-widening spectrum of African nationalities. There are West Africans from Guinea, the Ivory Coast, Liberia, Mali, Mauritania, Nigeria, and Upper Volta, as well as students from the Congo and the Malagasy Republic. In 1958, there was hardly a single student from any of these countries, and East Africa is now more clearly represented at Al-Azhar than ever before. In 1960, there were 197 Eritreans, 68 Ethiopians, 48 Somalis, 5 Ugandans, and 12 Zanzibaris, among several hundred other Africans. With 50% of all African students in Cairo studying at Al-Azhar, the authorities have not surprisingly been giving the university ever-increasing attention. An Egyptian report summarizes the position in these words: "We recognize the importance of this university and its attraction for students from abroad. Hence, the measures taken to improve its efficiency. These are mainly 1. The modernization of Al-Azhar by the addition of technical and scientific subjects to the curriculum, so as to provide the full range of lay subjects. 2. The decision to give instruction in languages other than Arabic. 3. The improvement of existing student hostels and the building of new ones." Cairo's religious efforts in Africa are widespread and diverse. They show no signs of decreasing.